It seems like most of us these days have heard all the stories about the guy in the creepy van. He knows your parents' names, maybe he knows your addresses. He always has candy. But in the late 1970s, some young people of the American Southwest weren't lucky enough to get those warnings. And today I've got their stories for you, the ones that inspired all those creepy videos we had to watch in elementary school. And after this, you'll be glad you did. I'm Jason, and this is Killer Bites. Sacramento in the 1950s was everything the residents there had ever wanted. Great new schools, lots of jobs, new houses, and sunny skies most of the year had young families flocking to brighter horizons from all over the USA. But in 1955, little Gerald Gallego wasn't always enjoying fun in the sun like the rest of his peers. His single mom had had a hard time paying bills and would have gentlemen suitors over each night to help them out. It wasn't the best example for her 9-year-old son. To make things worse, that year, Gerald's father would be the first criminal to get sentenced to a novel method of mortal punishment in Missouri, involving the use of a chemical known as hydrogen cyanide and maybe a bit of carbon monoxide. If it wasn't obvious enough to authorities that this was too much drama for a little boy's plate, they'd be acutely aware that by age 13, little Gerald would have his first run-in with the law after seriously harming a 6-year-old girl. This early beginning would preface a reign of terror that Gerald Gallego carried out for the rest of his life before finally facing justice. Before then, he'd go through 6 wives by his 24th birthday. In due time, he'd bring another victim along with him on his murder spree, or maybe, as many believe, an accomplice. They'd be an extra macabre 80s Bonnie and Clyde who journeyed across the Southwest, showing people there for the first time that real boogeymen lurk in the broad daylight. Charlene Williams was an adored and doted upon only child. She had a high IQ, many friends and hobbies, and the full support of her socially and financially stable parents in any of her aspirations. Nonetheless, she seemed to lose her way by high school and stopped caring about her education or hobbies, and spent most of her time going out to friends to smoke and drink. After 2 failed marriages of her own, she'd meet, and pretty quickly marry, Gerald Gallego. Within 2 weeks, they'd moved in together. Mary Beth Sowers was a shining light of ambition in Sacramento, where she was well loved by friends, family, and professors alike. The University of California student had a sweetheart named Craig, and they were said to be a big power couple on campus. At least that's what everyone thought before their luck would run out on November 2nd, 1980. Walking home after Craig's fraternity's holiday formal, they'd be spotted for the last time in the back of a strange car his frat brothers had never seen before. It belonged to Gerald and Charlene. Missing the next morning, a concerned friend found Mary's red Honda, the one the couple had taken to get to the formal, still in the lot with the keys inside of it. And when this friend reported them missing to the police, he was told that Craig had already missed his first class that day, completely out of character for the campus's most responsible power couple. Meanwhile, a witness had seen Charlene's car at the scene the night before, so they found it registered under her and her father's name, Charles Williams. But when they went to check up, her father told them that she'd been out on a date the night before with her husband, Steve, who she didn't live with. But police would be surprised when Charlene and her husband, Steven, pulled up just then in the driveway. Steven ditches right away when he sees the squad car outside, but Charlene goes in anyway and promptly vomits in the kitchen sink. At this point, the police are a bit confused, as I currently am right now. Charles told them that she was pregnant at the time and experiencing morning sickness, but when they asked her the questions directly, she let it slip that they'd taken her boyfriend's car out last night, and the police officer called her bluff right away. After a quick search of that car turned up nothing, she refused to continue answering questions, so the cops went back to study up on Steven. Gerald Gallego had a bit of a thing for guns, wouldn't you know it? And police were able to track down information that indicated he'd been fired from his last bar job for shooting one of those guns spontaneously into the air during a shift. So the bar owner told police that the bullets were still in the ceiling. So when they took a forensic sample, they'd found the evidence they'd needed. The bullets fired from Gerald's weapon were the same ones found earlier that day in Craig's recently discovered corpse. And Steven was none other than wanted man Gerald Gallego, who they now suspected had fled the state with wife Charlene after Charles told them she never came home that night. The chase was on, and few would believe just how far these sinister lovers would go to escape justice and satisfy Gerald's sickest fantasies. Years before, on September 11th, 1978, 17 and 16-year-old Rhonda Scheffler and Kippy Vaught were chilling at the mall like they usually were on the weekend. So when 21-year-old Charlene asked them if they wanted to smoke some pot in her car, well, they didn't think they'd be getting into any trouble, besides the drugs, of course. Charlene was another young woman they thought was kinda cool, but they didn't know that her 30-something husband would be waiting for them too when they left the mall that afternoon. Gerald, well, he didn't want a quick thrill like the innocent girls trying to pass their time. What he wanted was a permanent sex slave. He pulled a gun on Rhonda and Kippy immediately, ordered them to bind themselves and lay down on the mattress arranged inside the van. I mean, what else could they do? Taped and locked inside, he drove them all the way to the empty deserts of Nevada and lived out his fantasies for hours at the cost of their lives. He'd forced them to dig their own graves before walking back to the car alone. He ordered Charlene to drive, and she did, all the while knowing exactly what had happened. She'd agreed to help him commit the crime after years of him describing his sex slave fantasies to her already. Maybe at first she thought it was into some kinky power dynamic thing, or she might be able to satisfy this fantasy herself. So who knows what Charlene was thinking at this point, driving Gerald away from this horrific scene, but it wouldn't be another year before Gerald started talking about his fantasies again. If Charlene had thought that this single horrific act would satisfy her new husband into their happily ever after, she was dead wrong. In 1979, he'd tell her that he was ready for another special outing, and he needed her assistance again. This time, 14-year-old Brenda Judd and 13-year-old Sandra Colley would be waiting for their parents to pick them up from the day of fun they just had at the county fair in Reno, Nevada, when the van would cruise up before them. And they're just as oblivious as the Gallegos' last innocent underage victims. Charlene offered them money to help her put up flyers for her new business, and the helpful girls agreed. But just like before, Charlene would walk them to the van where her husband was waiting for them. This time, Gerald drove while Charlene sat in the back with the girls, stroking their hair and telling them that everything would be okay. They went on for hours, and the only stop they made was to a hardware store where Gerald would purchase a hammer and shovel before they ended up once again in the desert. When Gerald once again came back from the wilderness without the girls, Charlene had the guts to ask him what he'd done, as if, and he was frank with her. They're dead now. Just drive. It would become an annual ritual for this devilish duo. Gerald was satisfied for some months until his fantasies started creeping in again and again. He'd start discussing his fantasies, which were a bit more real than the term gives them credit for at this point, to an incessant degree up until the day their victims would meet their fate. All the while, Charlene presumably hoped that this time would be their last. I can't help but wonder where Charlene thought she might draw the line here. Maybe true love for her didn't have one? How many sexually deviant kidnappings and murders would you stay with your man through, Charlene? That number, for Charlene, would never be established. As the amount of time between Gerald's insatiable cravings got smaller and smaller, it would be 6 brutal slayings later, carried out in the same fashion with Charlene as bait, before Mary Elizabeth's body, the last of Gerald's victims, was discovered in Sacramento. Once again on the run after Gerald was identified by the police to be the Stephen they'd been looking into, the couple would be caught at a Western Union in Omaha, Nebraska, attempting to get cash that Charlene's father had wired to them. Back in Sacramento, charged with Mary and Craig's murders, the pair were separated and Charlene would have her son in the jail's hospital, immediately taken from her and given to the care of her parents. The loss of her son seemed to spark the first conscience in Charlene's heart, and at her next meeting with her lawyers, she'd tell them that she'd been a part of not just 2 murders, but 10. All this information would come out in detail when Charlene struck plea deals with the prosecutors across the United States to testify against her husband, which would reduce her prison sentence to 16 years and 8 months. She was found guilty of all 4 murder charges she was left with and cooperated with police to the extent that she even showed them where the bodies were buried. I guess the main reason behind her lighter sentence, even though she was an accomplice to these horrible acts all the way through. Gerald, on the other hand, would do that sickening thing that serial killers tend to do, and represented himself in court, disposing of his legal team without any deals or even a guilty plea. Charlene would take the stand in his trial, confessing that she was afraid of her husband, but her self-reported motive was love. She loved Gerald Gallego so much that as his wife, she felt a duty to help him carry out his sexual fantasies, even at the cost of 10 bright, young, innocent lives. Even under Gerald's own cross-examination, he struggled to discredit Charlene as a witness, airing all her dirty laundry before the judge finally put a stop to the increasingly petty lovers' quarrel. Gerald would step down to be found guilty on all counts by the jury after 2 hours of deliberation. He was one of the only American criminals to be given the death penalty twice and would wait on death row for 20 years before dying of rectal cancer at the age of 56 in 2002. Charlene was released in 1997 and now refers to herself as another victim of Gerald Gallego, saying, "There were victims that died and victims that lived. It took me a hell of a long time to learn that I was one of the ones who lived." What do you think? How could Charlene go along with all of this for so long, falling asleep on the sofa as Mary Beth's screams of mortal terror echoed through the rest of her and her husband's apartment? While Gerald Gallego seems to be another case of a psychotic serial killer who knows no guilt or shame, I think Charlene is the real mystery of this case. What does love really do to us, and how far would any of us go to save it? When and how do we stop when the person we love is a monster beyond reckoning? Check the comments for more thoughts, and be sure to leave your own. I'm Jason, and this has been a particularly chilling episode of Killer Bites.